In this lecture, we are going to be looking at Chapter 2, The Renaissance Ideal. Historian Jacob Burckhardt claimed that men and women stood on equal footing during the Renaissance. This assumption that equality of the sexes followed the humanist rediscovery of the, quote, freedom and dignity of men, unquote, dominated historical accounts of the Renaissance until it began to be repudiated by feminist scholars in the 1970s. One being Linda Nochlund's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? The historian Joan Kelly Goodall claims that the very developments opening up new possibilities for Renaissance men adversely affected women by leaving them with less actual power than they had enjoyed under feudalism. The author of our textbook, Chadwick, agrees with this, but further claims they stopped short of exploring women's relationship to the new Renaissance ideals of pictorial representation. Life in the Renaissance, what we're seeing is the development of capitalism and the emergence of the modern state, transformed economic, social, and familial relationships in Renaissance Italy. We look to the 15th century Florence for new ideals of artistic genius and individuality. Also during this time, linear perspective was developed and dominated Western painting until the end of the 19th century. Florence itself was the wealthiest and perhaps the most conservative of all the Italian city-states. The absence of women's names from the list of artists responsible for the Renaissance of Western culture in 15th century Florence deserves a careful scrutiny. It also helps to explain why the first well-known artist of the Renaissance, Sophonisba Anguissola, is found in the 16th rather than the 15th century, and why she is associated with the provincial city of Cremona rather than the artistic centers of Florence and Rome. And she's associated with the court of Spain rather than the civic papal patronage of Italy. Papal means from the church, it means from the Pope. As we have seen, a tradition of educated and skilled women in religious orders persisted in the 14th and 15th century despite an increasingly secularized society. However, outside the convent walls, women were barred from participating in the governmental patronage that created the public face of Renaissance Italy, and they played no part in guild commissions. Scholars have shown that women participated only in restricted areas of patronage outside the convent. We're talking about patronage, that means purchasing and commissioning artworks. These two areas were middle-class widows who were commissioning funerary altarpieces, and women who were the consorts of rulers, meaning that they were often the mistresses of rulers. The only women artists' names who have come down to us from the 15th century in Florence were nuns. And so we'll look to Florence, Italy. Florence, Italy grew rich in the 13th and 14th centuries from silk and wool industries and from banking. At the time, a literate wife was becoming essential to merchant families that formed the new Florentine middle class. So because of trade, travel, exploration, we're seeing this rise of a merchant middle class. Much of the artwork, production, and education, though, were controlled by the guilds. What were guilds? These began as medieval associations of craftsmen or merchants, often having considerable power. The revision of guild regulations in 1340 reaffirmed the woman's right to be admitted to the full privileges and duties in the guild, but women and less skilled workers were often left almost entirely without rights. Women were relegated to areas that required fewer skills, or skills of a kind that could be easily transferred to new households upon marriage. Social historians have shown that a small number of women appear in the count books of the Florentine wool manufacturers as weavers, but they were weavers of the plainer and coarser wools. By the 14th and early 15th century, the guilds became agencies of communal authority rather than corporate interest groups. Women were regulated to unskilled activities in the guilds at a historical moment when the demand for growing designers who could plan patterns for figured cloths and style the finished pieces grew. Guild records for the second half of the 14th century reveal virtually no women's names. Women's names are also missing from the employment rosters of construction projects in Florence, and this is a sharp departure from what we saw last time from the evidence of their participation in medieval building trades. By the early decades of the 15th century, art was acquiring a bourgeoisie, meaning a middle class, and secular character in an increasingly prosperous society. Its patrons were now mercantiles and professional men. Peasants, women, and the urban poor had almost no part to play in a cultural renaissance oriented toward the growth and the establishment of the city as a matter of civic pride. And this is also the idea of the rising idea of civic duty, meaning a duty to the state. 15th century writers viewed artistic activity as a public affirmation of the artist's role as citizen and the new republic state. Leonardo Bruni and other civic humanists stressed that men must set aside their private concerns in order to assume public roles. But citizenship in 15th century Florence was restricted to a small elite group of wealthy men who were set apart from women, even those of wealth and privilege. The division between public and private in Florence at that time restructured art as a public, primarily male activity. This ideology was strengthened as the rulers organized Renaissance society as a culture in which male privilege and male lines of property and succession were strongly valued. Women's loyalty was also often suspect, meaning they were not to be trusted. Leon Bautista Alberti's treatise on the family from 1435 is often cited as explaining the new humanist ideal, but it is, in fact, the major Renaissance statement on the middle-class domestication of women. Alberti was an Italian Renaissance humanist author, artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, and cartographer. Chadwick claims Alberti transformed these claims into a rigid prescription for women's lives. Women's virtues are chastity and motherhood. Her domain is the private world of the family. He cautioned men not to confide affairs of business to women, but to look to their wives for family and comfort. He also advances the humanist model of modesty, purity, passivity, physical attractiveness, chastity before marriage, and fidelity ever after for women. Now, our view of the 15th century in Italy is being constantly revised as research is bringing new documents to light. We now know of a small group of women humanists, most who were from wealthy and prominent northern Italian families, whose writings specifically addressed the situation of women. They were highly praised by male humanists. However, they were also urged to chastity and limited expectations. They were often forced to choose between marriage and learning. As humanist ideas with their stress on nature and antiquity began to influence the visual arts, education and knowledge became prized qualities for artists, as well as scholars and poets. The artist Giotto, often seen as the first real Renaissance artist, was described as a man of education and learning and given credit for returning art to the study of nature and the fundamental principles of antiquity. It's interesting that the first male artists separated from the massive craftsmen active during this period, including Boccaccio, Donatello, and Ghiberti, their interests lay mainly in scientific and theoretical knowledge, reveals the close link between humanist thought, science, and art at the time. And here on the slide for you, I have three different images. The image on the left is Donatello's David, 1430 to 1440, which is a bronze. Giotto's Lamentation from the Scrivini Chapel. It's a fresco, circa 1305. And on the right, you have Boccaccio's Holy Trinity from 1425. Now, at this time, mathematics and its teaching was the connection, and mathematical training was now organized by gender, meaning it was not available for women. Although humanist thinkers advocated a certain equality of education for the daughters and sons of wealthy people and patricians, by the 15th century, the practice of sending girls to public school had apparently been discontinued. Girls received their education, which were concentrated on Christian values and moral teachings, primarily at the home or in the convent. Girls were trained for either marriage or the cloister. Commercial mathematics, adapted to the needs of a growing merchant class, used skills which were also deeply ingrained in the principles of representation underlying 15th century painting. And you can see this in the textbook where they talk about the mathematics and its influence on Boccaccio's Holy Trinity. Now, it would be simplistic to suggest that women were unable to understand the new painting. But it is true that as a pictorial seeing established itself along learned and scientific principles taught only to men, it was increasingly organized according to male expectations. Painting became one of a growing list of activities in which women had intuitive but not learned knowledge and to whose laws they remained outsiders. The humanist encouragement of education for women did not include mathematics, rhetoric, or the sciences. When Bruni and other humanists advanced their view of Florence as a microcosm of divine order and proportion, or they explained that the ability to measure is God's greatest gift to man and therefore the root of all wisdom, they were reinforcing woman's removal to a place on the edge of the dominant discourse of Renaissance Florence. Also, the sight of vision, meaning seeing, became important in the public space. Scholars have traced the path by which the gaze became a metaphor for worldliness and civility associated with public men, and women became its object. At the same time as the male art of painting was elevated above the female art of embroidery. It was during this period that embroidery became the area of the woman amateur. It was redefined as a domestic art requiring manual labor and collective activity rather than individual genius, mathematical reasoning, and divine inspiration. Embroidery needlework came to signify the domesticity and femininity. We also see at this time, we're going to see the rise of the individual portrait, focus attention on women's costume, demeanor, and material establishment. And we see that through an examination of the profile portrait. Here, the emphasis on linear design and two-dimensionality results in a simplified rendering of reality rather than a naturalistic portrayal. Art historians have generally examined profile portraits in relation to their stylistic sources. But these new representations of secular men and women became, in the early 1980s, an important source for analysis of gender in the early Renaissance. Female profile portraits produce a version of femininity, wealth, and lineage through a careful cataloging of the objects of the wealthy Florentine household, including meticulously delineated gold and seed jewelry, brodequins and silk, and emblems and family crests. Women became signs for the honor and wealth which defined social prestige for Florentine citizens. In these idealized portraits, material and spiritual qualities are omitted, as if wealth were legitimized in the eye of God through the spirituality conveyed by the remote gazes and severe poses of the female sitters. These female figures did not look. They are turned away and presented as surfaces to be gazed upon. While this does also hold true for male profile portraits, what we see is these are actually largely abandoned as representations of male authority by the mid-century. Here, the image that we are looking at is Ghirlandaio's painting of Giovanni Tornabuoni nei Albizzi from 1488. In this work, we see it emphasizes her role as a chaste, decorous piece of her husband's lineage. His initial L appears on her shoulder, and his family's triangular emblem is embroidered on her garment. The inscription behind the figure reads, "O art, if thou were able to depict the conduct of the soul, no lovelier painting would exist on earth." This commends her virtuous conduct and spiritual quality. And this is actually a commemorative painting. It was commissioned after she died in 1488 during her pregnancy. She appears as a beautiful object of contemplation at a time when women were banned from displaying themselves at windows and when sumptuary laws barred ornate and lavish dress. And then now we're going to move to an examination of women artists. It was not until the 16th century that a few women managed to turn the new Renaissance emphasis on virtue and gentility into positive attributes for the woman artist. Most of their careers were made possible by birth into artistic families and the training that accompanied it, or into the upper class where the spread of Renaissance ideas about the desirability of education opened some new possibilities for women. For all of them, their social and professional accomplishments were conflated so that their success as an artist was inseparable from their virtues as a woman. And here, again, we're going to look at Sophonisba Anguissola. And her example opened up the possibility of painting to women as a socially acceptable profession, while her work established new conventions for self-portraiture by women and for Italian genre painting. However, she has also been subjected to wildly fluctuating critical evaluations like many other women artists. She was born around 1535, and she was daughter to the widower Michael Anguissola, and he decided to educate his 7 children according to humanist ideals of the Renaissance. In fact, 3 of her sisters also became painters. Now, her relative lack of training, compared with that of major male artists of her day, is historical fact. But she remains the only woman of her time credited with the ability to infuse an image with life. Her work was both appreciated and understood by her contemporaries. However, this high regard held by the 17th and 18th century collectors did not survive until the 19th century. In fact, many of her works were assigned to other male artists. And it wasn't until the 20th century that her significance was restored. She is unique in her astonishing variety of portraits and in producing more self-portraits than any other artist between the times of Albert Dürer and Rembrandt. Now, the work we're looking at here is Bernardino Campi painting Sophonisba Anguissola in the late 1550s, and it is an oil on canvas. Make sure we have the right side. This suggests that not only was she aware of her own image as an exemplar of female achievement, but also that she understood the importance of artistic lineage between pupil and master and her unique role as a producer of images of women. Here, she paints herself as if she is being painted. Remember, she's the one creating the painting, so she's painting someone else painting her. Perhaps this is articulating the complex relationship between female subjectivity and agency, its positioning within patriarchal structures of knowledge, and the role of woman as an object of representation. The Duke of Alba called attention to the Spanish court to her work. She was escorted to Spain in 1559, where she served as a court painter and leading-in-waiting to successive queens Isabel of Valois and Anna of Austria until 1573. She received a salary as a lady-in-waiting, and in 1561 she was given a lifelong pension that was payable to her father. Her status at court is shown by the fact that before she left Spain, the king arranged her marriage to a wealthy Italian and provided a dowry. Now, her social status prohibited her from selling her work, and her paintings circulated within elevated social circles in which they were given as gifts. Thus, the first woman painter to achieve fame and respect did so within a set of constraints that removed her from competing for commissions with her male contemporaries, and that affecting placed her within a critical category of her own. Her presentation of herself as a modest young woman of refinement and culture places the work in a tradition of self-portraits which articulate the Renaissance ideal of the artist as gentleman or gentlewoman rather than artisan. Her complex relationship to the traditions of Northern Italian and Spanish portraiture has actually led to her work being confused with that of Titian, Da Vinci, and others. Her social status, her social standing, and her status as a lady-in-waiting mediated her relationship to the royal family in ways not necessarily shared by all court painters, allowing her more consistent access to female members of the court than might otherwise have been the case. As long as she stressed her status as a gentlewoman, her actions as a professional painter did not conflict with the ideology of Renaissance womanhood as outlined in Castiglioni's text, The Courtier, which was the basically guidebook on etiquette and standards of the time. Also at this time, we began to see more representations of the female nude. This glorification of erotic and aesthetic experience underlines the Neoplatonic influence on 16th century painting. Under the influence of Neoplatonism, beauty became associated with idealized womanhood. Anguissola's age and sex prevented her from engaging in an aesthetic dialogue which revolved around Neoplatonic concepts of the metaphoric relationship between paint and beauty, the earthly and the sublime, and the material and the celestial. Male writers often referred to her and her sisters as prodigies of nature rather than artists because they identified the act of painting with the male artist's sexual prowess. She could not use paint as a metaphor for the possessibility beauty without violating the social role that made her life as a painter possible. Her works are seen to reveal the inner attributes of modesty, patience, and virtue. Now, we also do see some good from her success. Her father's decision to dedicate his daughter to art set a precedent, and we began to see other Italian artists take on more female pupils. Also, her invitation to the court of Philip II of Spain was the precedent for many other women artists who found support in the courts of Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries.